The murder of Hypatia, how political and religious conflict destroyed Alexandria's greatest female scholar. In March of the year 415, during the Christian season of Lent, a carriage moved through the crowded streets of Alexandria. Inside sat one of the most famous intellectuals in the Roman world. Her name was Hypatia. She was a mathematician, philosopher, teacher, and public figure whose students included members of the political and religious elite. For years, she had spoken openly in the city, taught in public, advised powerful men, and commanded respect in a society where very few women could enter intellectual or political life on equal terms with men. But on this day, her reputation offered no protection. A group of men stopped the carriage. They pulled Hypatia into the street and dragged her toward a building known as the Caesareum. The group was led, according to the earliest detailed surviving account, by a church reader named Peter. What happened next was not a private assassination carried out in silence. It was a public killing performed with confidence, anger, and a desire to erase the victim completely. Hypatia was stripped, murdered, and dismembered. Her remains were taken outside the center of the city and burned. The attackers did not merely want her dead. They wanted to destroy her body, humiliate her memory, and send a warning to anyone who stood on the wrong side of Alexandria's political struggle. More than 16 centuries later, the central questions remain. Why did a group of religious supporters choose a mathematician as their enemy? Was Hypatia murdered because she represented pagan philosophy in a Christianizing empire? Was she accused of magic because her learning frightened people who did not understand it? Or had she become a convenient target in a conflict between two powerful men, Orestes, the Roman governor of Alexandria, and Cyril, the city's bishop? No surviving document proves that Cyril ordered her death. No witness left a record of a secret command. Yet the killers came from a community connected to his political cause. The murder weakened his rival, and Cyril emerged from the crisis with greater authority. To understand what happened to Hypatia, we must look beyond the image of a lonely scholar surrounded by fanatics. Her murder was the final act of a much larger drama involving religion, imperial government, ethnic conflict, urban violence, rumor, and the struggle to control one of the most important cities in the ancient Mediterranean world. Alexandria had always been a city of ambition. It was founded by Alexander the Great in 331 before the Common Era on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, and it soon became one of the great urban centers of the Hellenistic world. Its position made it a bridge between the agricultural wealth of the Nile Valley and the commercial networks of the Mediterranean. Grain, papyrus, glass, textiles, spices, books, and ideas passed through its harbor. Ships arrived from the Greek world, Italy, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Merchants, soldiers, officials, pilgrims, sailors, teachers, and students crowded its streets. The city was famous for the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the wonders of the ancient world, and for institutions associated with learning, especially the Mouseion and the libraries that later generations would remember collectively as the Library of Alexandria. By Hypatia's lifetime, however, the legendary library of the early Ptolemaic period was no longer a single untouched institution, filled with every book of the ancient world. The history of Alexandria's libraries was complicated, involving decline, damage, dispersal, and changing centers of study over many centuries. Hypatia did not teach in the original Great Library, and her death did not take place inside it. The popular image of the last guardian of the library dying as the building burns belongs more to modern storytelling than to secure historical evidence. What remained real was Alexandria's intellectual reputation. The city continued to attract scholars and students. Mathematics, medicine, philosophy, theology, grammar, and astronomy were studied there. Christian thinkers and pagan philosophers argued over truth, but they also inherited many of the same Greek intellectual traditions. The boundaries between communities were not always simple. A Christian could study Greek philosophy. A pagan teacher could educate Christian students. A Roman official could be both a committed Christian and a defender of imperial law against the political ambitions of a bishop. Alexandria was not a city divided into two clean camps. It contained Greek-speaking elites, native Egyptians, Jewish communities with deep roots in the city, Roman administrators, pagan religious groups, and several Christian factions that did not always agree with one another. Religious identity mattered, but so did class, occupation, neighborhood, patronage, ethnicity, and access to power. The city's brilliance existed beside a long tradition of public disorder. Crowds could gather quickly. Religious festivals could become political demonstrations. Disputes that began in courts, churches, theaters, or marketplaces could move into the streets. Civic groups, monks, clergy, soldiers, and neighborhood supporters could be mobilized by ambitious leaders. Alexandria had produced great works of scholarship, but it had also seen riots, factional violence, and the public humiliation of officials. This combination of intellectual prestige and political volatility formed the world in which Hypatia lived. The Roman Empire of the early 5th century was also changing. Christianity had moved from a persecuted religion to an institution supported by emperors. Temples associated with traditional religion had lost privileges, and in some places they were closed, damaged, or converted. Bishops were no longer only spiritual leaders responsible for worship and doctrine. In major cities, they could control wealth, charitable networks, clergy, crowds of supporters, and channels of communication, reaching far beyond the local population. They negotiated with governors, advised emperors, intervened in legal disputes, organized aid, and sometimes challenged civil officials directly. Roman governors still represented imperial law, taxation, order, and administration, but their authority could be weakened if a bishop commanded greater loyalty from the population. In Alexandria, this institutional rivalry became especially dangerous. The bishop's office had developed into one of the most powerful positions in the city. Its supporters were organized, visible, and capable of acting in the streets. The imperial governor, by contrast, possessed formal authority backed by Rome, but he needed cooperation from local communities to govern effectively. When Hypatia's story is reduced to a simple conflict between science and religion, this political structure disappears. Yet without it, her death makes little sense. She was not merely a private scholar. She was connected to the civil administration, respected by officials, and able to speak with men who held power. In a peaceful city, those connections might have protected her. In Alexandria, they placed her at the center of a struggle between institutions. Hypatia was probably born sometime between approximately 350 and 370, though the exact year remains uncertain. She was the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, a mathematician and astronomer, known for his work on earlier Greek scientific texts. Theon participated in a scholarly culture based on commentary, explanation, correction, and preservation. Ancient mathematical works were difficult, and they survived not only because people copied them, but because teachers organized them, clarified them, and produced versions that students could understand. Hypatia grew up inside this world. Her education appears to have been exceptional. She studied mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, rhetoric, and the literary traditions expected of an elite intellectual. Later sources present her as a gifted speaker with remarkable self-control and dignity. Rather than remaining in a private household, she entered public intellectual life. She taught students, addressed audiences, and spoke with officials. This alone made her unusual. Women in the late Roman world could exercise influence through wealth, family, religious office, or proximity to powerful men. But Hypatia's authority rested above all on education and personal reputation. She became known as a philosopher, a title that meant more than someone who enjoyed abstract thought. In late antiquity, philosophy could describe an entire way of life. It involved discipline, moral formation, intellectual training, and the search for the highest truth. Hypatia belonged to the broad tradition now called Neoplatonism, which developed from the philosophy of Plato and later interpreters. In simple terms, Neoplatonists believed that the visible world was part of a larger spiritual order. The human soul could rise toward deeper understanding through reason, ethical discipline, contemplation, and the study of reality. Mathematics was not separate from this search. Geometry and astronomy trained the mind to recognize order beyond the confusion of everyday life. Numbers, shapes, and celestial movements revealed patterns that could lead the intellect toward higher principles. Hypatia was therefore not a modern scientist fighting against all religion. She was a religiously and philosophically serious thinker in an ancient tradition. Nor were all her students pagan. Some were Christians who saw no contradiction between learning from a pagan philosopher and remaining committed to their faith. One of the best-known examples is Synesius of Cyril, a former student who later became a Christian bishop. Surviving letters show his deep respect and affection for Hypatia. He asked her advice, discussed scientific instruments, and treated her as a trusted intellectual guide. Their relationship demonstrates that the boundaries between pagan philosophy and Christianity could be more flexible than later legends suggest. Hypatia's mathematical reputation is harder to reconstruct, because no work surviving under her name can be identified with complete certainty. Ancient and medieval, Hypatia's mathematical reputation is harder to reconstruct because no work surviving under her name can be identified with complete certainty. Ancient and medieval references associate her with commentaries on major mathematical and astronomical texts. She may have worked on Diophantus's Arithmetica, on Apollonius's study of conic sections, and on astronomical material connected with Ptolemy. Scholars continue to debate the exact extent of her contributions and whether parts of texts transmitted through later manuscripts preserve her editorial work. It is safer to say that she participated in the high-level teaching, explanation, and transmission of mathematics than to present her as the inventor of discoveries for which evidence is missing. She was also associated with scientific instruments. Synesius referred to an astrolabe and to a hydroscope, though the exact design and Hypatia's role in their construction are not always clear. Popular accounts sometimes claim that she invented the astrolabe or the hydrometer, but versions of such instruments existed before her. Her importance lies not in attaching every ancient invention to her name, but in recognizing her as a leading teacher who understood. Accounts sometimes claim that she invented the astrolabe or the hydrometer, but versions of such instruments existed before her. Her importance lies not in attaching every ancient invention to her name, but in recognizing her as a leading teacher who understood advanced mathematics and astronomy well enough to explain, apply, and perhaps refine existing knowledge. Her intellectual power was matched by her public reputation. The Christian historian Socrates Scholasticus, writing only a few decades after her death, described her as a woman who had achieved great learning and who surpassed many philosophers of her time. He said that she appeared before magistrates and that people respected her because of her dignity and confidence. This is an extraordinary picture. In a major Roman city, a woman known for philosophy could approach officials without embarrassment, speak in public, and advise members of the elite. Her authority did not depend on an official title. It depended on the belief that she possessed wisdom, judgment, and moral seriousness. Students who passed through her school entered wider networks of government, church, and society. Those connections gave Hypatia influence. They also meant that her classroom was not isolated from politics. Ideas, loyalties, and personal relationships created around a teacher could later shape decisions in the public world. To understand why this influence became dangerous, we must meet the two men whose rivalry transformed Alexandria. The first was Cyril. He became Bishop of Alexandria in 412, following the death of his uncle Theophilus. The succession was contested, and Cyril's rise was accompanied by tension. He inherited not only a religious office, but a powerful urban institution. The Alexandrian church possessed clergy, property, charitable resources, and devoted supporters. Cyril was also an important theologian who would later play a major role in controversies over the nature of Christ. To his admirers, he was a defender of Christian truth and church authority. To his opponents, he could appear uncompromising, politically aggressive, and willing to use popular pressure. Both images capture part of the historical figure. Cyril was not merely a villain waiting to destroy philosophy. He was a skilled and determined leader operating in a world where theology and politics could not be separated. Protecting doctrine meant protecting institutions. Protecting institutions meant controlling appointments, public influence, property, and access to imperial power. The second man was Orestes, the Roman prefect of Egypt, and the leading civil official in Alexandria. Orestes represented the emperor in the machinery of imperial government. He was responsible for administration, law, taxation, and order. Importantly, Orestes was a Christian. This fact destroys the simplest version of the story. The conflict was not between a pagan governor defending Hypatia and a Christian bishop attacking her. It was between two Christian authorities whose offices overlapped and whose supporters competed for control. Orestes could not allow a bishop to act as though church power stood above Roman government. Cyril could not easily accept a political order in which the bishop remained subordinate to a civil official who might limit the church's actions. Each man claimed to defend legitimate authority. Each suspected that the other was expanding beyond proper boundaries. The rivalry intensified through a series of violent confrontations. One major crisis involved Alexandria's Jewish community. Relations among Christians and Jews in the city had long included periods of cooperation, competition, and hostility. During Cyril's early episcopate, accusations and street violence escalated. Ancient accounts differ in details and reflect strong biases, but they agree that serious conflict occurred. A violent incident involving Christian worshippers was followed by a harsh response. Cyril moved against the Jewish community, and many Jews were expelled or forced from their homes. Property was seized or occupied. For Cyril's supporters, this may have appeared to be protection of Christians and punishment of enemies. For Orestes, it was an attack on civil order and imperial jurisdiction. The governor believed that decisions affecting an entire community belonged to the state, not to a bishop acting through popular support. The conflict, therefore, became more than a religious dispute. It became a test of who had the right to govern Alexandria. Orestes reported events to the emperor. Cyril also communicated with imperial authorities. Each side attempted to define the crisis in a way that justified its own actions. The bishop reportedly attempted a public. Cyril also communicated with imperial authorities. Each side attempted to define the crisis in a way that justified its own actions. The bishop reportedly attempted a public reconciliation, but Orestes did not accept it. Perhaps the governor believed that any symbolic submission would weaken his office. Perhaps he did not trust Cyril's intentions. Whatever the reason, the rivalry continued. Then it became personal and violent. A large group of monks came into Alexandria from the Egyptian desert. Monks could be admired as holy men who rejected comfort and devoted themselves to spiritual discipline, but groups of militant monks could also act as political forces. They confronted Orestes in the streets, insulted him, and accused him of being a pagan. The accusation was false. Orestes publicly declared his Christian identity and stated that he had been baptized by the Bishop of Constantinople. Yet the confrontation did not end. A monk named Ammonius struck the governor in the head with a stone drawing blood. Citizens intervened and the monks fled. Ammonius was captured, tortured under official authority, and died from the punishment. Cyril then attempted to honor him as a martyr, reportedly giving him a new name that presented him as admirable for his courage. But many Christians were uncomfortable with this. Ammonius had not died for refusing to deny his faith. He had attacked a Roman governor. The attempt to treat him as a martyr seems to have failed, and Cyril allowed the matter to fade. Still, the event revealed how far the conflict had gone. A representative of the emperor had been assaulted by men acting in defense of the bishop's cause. Orestes could use law and punishment, but he could not fully control the streets. Cyril could inspire loyalty, but he could not always control how supporters expressed it. At this point, Hypatia entered the story, not because she suddenly began teaching forbidden ideas, but because of her relationship with Orestes. The governor valued her advice and moved within the same elite circles that respected her. Hypatia's influence may have helped Orestes maintain support among educated citizens, traditional civic leaders, and people who feared the growing power of the bishop. We should not imagine that she held an official office or directed government policy behind closed doors. The surviving evidence does not justify turning her into a secret ruler, but influence does not require title. A respected philosopher could shape opinion, introduce people, advise friends, and give moral legitimacy to a political position. In a city governed by reputation and personal networks, that mattered. A rumor began to spread. According to Socrates' Scholasticus, people claimed that Hypatia was preventing Orestes from reconciling with Cyril. This accusation was powerful because it gave a simple explanation for a complicated political failure. Instead of admitting that the governor and bishop had deep institutional reasons to distrust one another, supporters could blame one person. Peace was possible, the rumor suggested, but a pagan woman with unusual access to the governor was secretly blocking it. The claim transformed Hypatia from advisor into manipulator, from philosopher into conspirator, and from public intellectual into enemy. It also drew upon fears that had long surrounded independent women. A woman who spoke to powerful men could be portrayed as controlling them. A woman with knowledge could be described as deceptive. A woman who understood astronomy and mathematics could be accused of magic. Later, hostile accounts emphasized sorcery, claiming that Hypatia used magical arts to influence Orestes. Such accusations should not be accepted as factual evidence. They reveal how opponents attempted to explain her authority. If people could not understand why a governor respected a female philosopher, they could imagine secret enchantment instead of intellectual trust. Political demonization often follows a recognizable pattern. First, a person is identified as an obstacle. Then the person's motives are questioned. Influence becomes manipulation. Difference becomes danger. Rumor becomes common knowledge. Finally, violence can be presented not as murder, but as the removal of a threat. Hypatia's position made her especially vulnerable. Orestes had guards, legal authority, and the distant protection of the emperor. Cyril had clergy, institutions, and popular support. Hypatia had reputation, students, and friends. In normal times, these were powerful forms of protection. During a political crisis, they could disappear in a moment. The surviving sources do not allow us to reconstruct every meeting, every sermon, or every conversation that led to the attack. We do not know exactly when the killers decided to act. We do not know whether they planned the murder days in advance or gathered quickly after hearing a rumor. We do not know how much Peter, the church reader named as their leader, understood about the larger political struggle. Yet the attack itself appears organized, enough to suggest purpose. The killers knew Hypatia's movements. They were able to stop her carriage, seize her, and take her to a significant public building. They acted in daylight and seemed not to have feared immediate punishment. This confidence matters. Mobs do not always require written orders. They can act because members believe that powerful people will approve, excuse, or at least fail to punish them. In March 415, Hypatia traveled through Alexandria as she had likely done many times before. A group intercepted her. The ancient account says they were driven by fierce zeal. Peter led them. They dragged Hypatia from the carriage and brought her to the Caesareum. The building had once been associated with imperial worship and had later become a Christian church. Choosing such a place gave the murder symbolic force. Hypatia was not taken to a hidden house or killed quietly on an isolated road. She was carried into a space connected to public authority and religious identity. There, the attackers stripped her. Ancient descriptions say they killed her with ostraca, a word that can refer to broken pottery, tiles, shells, or sharp fragments. Modern retellings often choose one specific object and describe it in graphic detail, but the exact instrument is uncertain. What is certain is the brutality. After killing her, the attackers cut or tore her body into pieces. They carried the remains to a place called Cineron and burned them. In the Roman world, treatment of the dead carried enormous meaning. Burial, mourning, and memory were part of social identity. To dismember and burn Hypatia's body outside normal funeral practices was to deny her dignity after death. It may also have been intended as purification, punishment, or total erasure. We cannot know the private thoughts of the killers, but their actions communicated contempt. They wanted no grave where students could gather, no intact body to honor, and no peaceful transition from public life to remembered ancestor. The violence was physical, political, and symbolic at the same time. It is easy for a modern audience to focus on the horrifying method of the murder and miss its strategic meaning. Hypatia's death removed a respected figure from Orestes' circle. It demonstrated that the governor could not protect even one of the city's most famous citizens. It warned others that association with him could be dangerous. It also changed the emotional balance of the conflict. Before the murder, Orestes and Cyril were rivals. After the murder, one side had shown that supporters could eliminate a person widely believed to stand between them and political victory. The killing, therefore, resembles both mob violence and political assassination. It was mob violence because a group physically carried it out in public, apparently driven by rumor, loyalty, and religious passion. It was political assassination because the victim had become important within a struggle for power, and her removal benefited one faction. These categories do not exclude each other. A political leader does not need to hire a professional assassin when a crowd has already been taught whom to hate. This brings us to the most difficult question. Did Cyril order Hypatia's murder? The honest answer is that the surviving evidence does not prove that he did. No ancient source preserves a direct command. No letter from Cyril instructs Peter or anyone else to seize her. No reliable eyewitness claims to have heard such an order. Historians must distinguish suspicion from proof, yet the absence of a written order does not end the investigation. The killers were linked to the Christian community. Peter held a church role. The rumor that made Hypatia a target emerged from the conflict between Cyril and Orestes. Her death weakened Orestes and removed a person believed to oppose. Reconciliation. Socrates, Scholasticus, who was himself a Christian, wrote that the murder brought disgrace upon Cyril and the Church of Alexandria. His wording stops short of accusing Cyril of direct command, but it places the crime inside the political and religious environment of Cyril's leadership. Several possibilities remain. Cyril may have secretly ordered the killing. He may have encouraged hostility without specifying violence. He may have wanted Hypatia isolated but lost control of his supporters. He may have known nothing about the plan until after her death. Or the mob may have acted independently, convinced that it was defending the bishop and the church. The evidence cannot conclusively choose among these possibilities. However, moral and political responsibility can be broader than criminal proof. Leaders shape language, define enemies, reward loyalty, and create expectations about what actions will be tolerated. Even when no command survives, we can ask whether a leader benefited from an atmosphere in which opponents were treated as threats to the community. We can ask whether the leader condemned the crime, punished those responsible, or allowed silence to protect them. In Hypatia's case, no meaningful punishment of the killers is known. Cyril's position did not collapse. The church did not lose control. Instead, Orestes soon disappears from the surviving narrative, while Cyril's influence continued to grow. This does not mean that Hypatia's death immediately ended classical learning in Alexandria. That claim is one of the most common myths surrounding the story. Philosophers continued to teach in the city. Christian scholars continued to study Greek texts. Mathematics and astronomy did not vanish in 415. Pagan intellectual traditions survived in different forms, and later Alexandrian thinkers developed important philosophical and scientific work. The Roman world did not move from light to darkness in a single afternoon. History rarely changes so neatly. Nor was Hypatia necessarily the final pagan philosopher, the last librarian, or the last person capable of understanding ancient science. These dramatic titles make powerful slogans, but they reduce a complex historical period to a symbolic ending. What her death did demonstrate was that intellectual prestige could not protect someone caught between powerful institutions. It showed that a city famous for learning could also destroy one of its teachers. It revealed how quickly rumor could convert a respected public figure into a target. The consequences for Hypatia's immediate circle must have been profound. Students had lost their teacher. Friends had lost a trusted advisor. Members of the elite had seen that public reputation offered little defense against organized violence. Some may have left Alexandria or withdrawn from politics. Others may have adapted quietly to the new balance of power. Because the surviving evidence is limited, we cannot trace each person's response. But the silence surrounding Orestes after the crisis is significant. The governor who had resisted Cyril no longer appears as an effective counterweight. Whether he was recalled, removed, or simply disappears because the sources no longer follow him, his political position had clearly weakened. Cyril remained bishop until his death in 444. He became one of the most influential theological figures of late antiquity, especially during the controversies leading to the Council of Ephesus in 431. In later Christian tradition, he was honored as a saint and major church teacher. This legacy exists beside the unresolved shadow of Hypatia's murder. To recognize Cyril's theological importance does not require ignoring the violence associated with his rise. To condemn the murder does not require inventing evidence that he personally gave the order. Historical understanding demands that both truths remain visible. Hypatia's story survived because ancient writers gave it meanings that extended beyond one death. Socrates, Scholasticus, presented her as a woman of exceptional learning and dignity, who became the victim of political jealousy. His account is especially important because he was a Christian historian, not a pagan writer, attempting to attack Christianity from the outside. He explicitly stated that murder, fighting, and actions of that kind were entirely foreign to the Christian faith. For him, the crime disgraced the Alexandrian church. Other writers told the story differently. Damascus, a pagan philosopher writing later, was much more hostile towards Cyril and portrayed him as jealous of Hypatia's reputation and influence. John of Nicaea, a Christian bishop writing centuries after the event, described Hypatia negatively and treated her death as part of a victory over pagan influence and magic. These conflicting accounts remind us that ancient histories were not neutral reports. Writers selected details according to their religious commitments, political views, and moral purposes. Modern historians compare them, evaluate their distance from the event, and look for agreements that may preserve a core of fact. Across the differences, several points remain strong. Hypatia was a famous philosopher. She had influence with Orestes. A rumor blamed her for blocking reconciliation with Cyril. A group led by Peter seized and killed her, and the murder was connected to the political conflict in Alexandria. Beyond those points, certainty decreases. Later centuries transformed Hypatia again. During the Enlightenment, writers used her death as evidence of religious intolerance and the danger of clerical power. In the 19th century, novels and paintings often presented her as a beautiful young pagan heroine, surrounded by a violent Christian crowd. These works reflected the concerns of their own societies as much as the realities of 5th century Alexandria. Hypatia became a symbol. In debates over science, religion, women, empire, and freedom of thought, modern films continued the transformation. The story was sometimes connected to the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, even though the chronology and evidence do not support a simple direct link. Scenes of scrolls burning, astronomers defending knowledge, and fanatics attacking reason create a clear emotional narrative. The real history is less simple but more revealing. Hypatia did not die because one side represented pure science, and the other represented pure religion. She died in a world where philosophy could be religious, Christians could study classical science, bishops could behave like political leaders, and a Christian governor could resist a Christian church. She became dangerous because knowledge, social authority, gender, and political allegiance met in one visible person. Her gender cannot be treated as a minor detail. Hypatia's public position challenged expectations even among people who admired her. Ancient praise often emphasized her self-control, modesty, and dignity, qualities used to explain why men accepted her authority. In other words, she was respected partly because observers believed she had overcome the weaknesses that ancient culture often associated with women. This praise reveals both admiration and prejudice. Her enemies could reverse the same assumptions. A woman who advised a governor could be accused of seduction or manipulation. A woman who possessed specialized knowledge could be labeled a witch. A woman without a husband or male political office could be portrayed as operating outside the natural order. The accusation that she used magic to control Orestes offered a gendered explanation for influence that opponents did not want to recognize as legitimate. Her murder also involved public stripping, an act intended to destroy dignity as well as life. The attackers reduced a respected teacher to a body they believed they could control, expose, and erase. The symbolic violence was therefore tied to both politics and gender. Yet Hypatia should not be remembered only as a victim. When her life is reduced to the manner of her death, the killers continue to define her. Before the attack, she had spent years teaching, reasoning, writing, and guiding students. She represented a living intellectual tradition. Her importance lies not simply in being a woman who entered a male world, but in being a philosopher whose authority was recognized by people across religious boundaries. Her students did not admire her because she was destined to become a martyr. They admired her because she was an extraordinary teacher. The letters of Synesius suggest warmth, trust, and intellectual companionship. They allow us to glimpse Hypatia not as an abstract symbol, but as a person to whom former students turned when they needed advice, instruments, books, or reassurance. This human dimension is essential. Political murders work by simplifying a person into an enemy. Historical memory should resist that simplification by restoring the complexity that violence attempted to remove. The murder also raises questions about crowds and responsibility that remain relevant far beyond the ancient world. A crowd is made of individuals, but individuals inside a crowd can feel protected by collective purpose. Rumor reduces uncertainty. Moral language turns aggression into duty. A target is described as the source of social division, and violence becomes imaginable as a path to peace. Hypatia was accused of preventing reconciliation. Once people accepted that claim, killing her could be presented as removing the obstacle. This is one of the darkest patterns in political violence. The victim is blamed not only for conflict, but for making violence necessary. The killers can then imagine themselves as defenders rather than criminals. Institutions may encourage this process through silence. A leader does not need to say, "Kill this person." It may be enough to repeatedly describe the person as dangerous, impure, disloyal, or responsible for the suffering of the community. Supporters complete the logic themselves. Afterward, the leader can deny direct involvement while keeping the political benefit. We cannot prove that this exact process occurred in Cyril's private strategy, but the structure helps explain how a rumor about Hypatia could become fatal. It also explains why the distinction between direct command and indirect responsibility matters. A criminal court may require evidence of an order. Historical judgment can examine a wider environment: rhetoric, power, incentives, organization, and the response after the crime. Did leaders attempt to calm supporters? Did they condemn false accusations? Did they protect opponents? Did they punish attackers? In Alexandria, the public balance after Hypatia's death suggests that the murder succeeded. Politically, whether or not it had been officially planned, the governor's position faded, the bishop's authority survived. The killers did not become famous examples of legal punishment. The city moved forward, but under a changed distribution of fear and power. Some retellings describe Hypatia as an atheist or a modern rationalist born too early. This is misleading. She lived in a spiritual and philosophical world very different from modern secular science. She likely believed that reason could lead the soul toward divine reality. Her teaching did not reject all religion. It belonged to a philosophical form of religious inquiry. Other retellings describe every Christian in Alexandria as an enemy of knowledge. This is also false. Christian intellectuals preserved, debated, and transformed Greek learning. Hypatia taught Christians, and a Christian historian preserved the most sympathetic early account of her death. The conflict should therefore not be used to condemn an entire religion, or to imagine that all believers acted as one group. The murder was committed by specific people in a particular political environment. At the same time, avoiding oversimplification must not become an excuse to minimize religiously justified violence. The attackers were associated with a Christian cause, acted in a city where the church had become a major political force, and killed a woman portrayed as an enemy of reconciliation. Socrates himself believed the act disgraced Christianity. The most responsible interpretation holds these facts together. Hypatia's murder was not a timeless battle, in which science and religion can be separated into pure opposing armies. It was a political crime shaped by religious identity, institutional rivalry, gendered suspicion, and urban violence. Its complexity makes it more useful, not less. Simple stories allow audiences to place evil safely in one category. Complex stories force us to examine how ordinary loyalties, legitimate institutions, and respected leaders can become connected to terrible outcomes. Imagine Alexandria in the days after the murder. The streets continue to fill with merchants and worshippers. Ships enter the harbor. Officials issue orders. Teachers meet students. The machinery of urban life resumes. Yet everyone knows what happened. A woman whose name had commanded respect was taken from her carriage and killed in a public building. Her body was burned. No powerful protector arrived in time. No visible justice restored the moral order. For Hypatia's friends, the city would have felt different. Familiar streets had become the landscape of betrayal. For Orestes, the crime was a demonstration of weakness. For Cyril's supporters, whether they approved of the killing or not, the removal of Hypatia changed the conflict. For the killers, the absence of immediate punishment may have confirmed their belief that they had acted with acceptable zeal. Political violence does not end when the victim dies. It changes what everyone else believes is possible. It teaches people which opinions are dangerous, which alliances carry risk, and which institutions can act without consequence. This may have been the most lasting immediate effect of Hypatia's murder. It created silence around the surviving opposition. The event also created a problem for Christian writers. How could a religion that preached moral discipline and condemned murder explain the actions of men who claimed to defend the church? Socrates answered by separating the crime from true Christianity. The murder, he wrote in effect, was entirely foreign to the faith. This was both a moral condemnation and an attempt to protect religious identity from the behavior of believers. Similar arguments appear throughout history whenever institutions confront violence committed in their name. The distinction can be sincere and important, but it also raises another question. What structures allowed those believers to imagine that violence served the institution? Hypatia's story offers no comfortable answer. The search for one person to blame may itself reflect our desire for a simple conclusion. If Cyril gave the order, then the mystery is solved. A powerful bishop arranged the death of a rival's advisor. If the mob acted alone, then Cyril can be separated from the crime and the story becomes an outbreak of uncontrolled fanaticism. The evidence supports neither conclusion with certainty. Power often works through suggestion, expectation, and shared interest rather than formal commands. A leader's supporters may understand what outcome is desired without being told how to achieve it. They may also act more violently than the leader intended. Afterward, everyone can claim that responsibility belongs elsewhere. Peter and the attackers carried out the physical crime. They are directly responsible for Hypatia's death. The rumor makers who portrayed her as an obstacle helped make her vulnerable. The political struggle between Cyril and Orestes created the conditions in which the rumor became powerful. Cyril bears, at least, the burden of leadership over a movement whose supporters committed the murder, even though direct criminal responsibility remains unproven. Orestes, despite his authority, failed to protect her, though it is unclear whether he knew the attack was coming or possessed the power to stop it. The imperial system failed to impose order and justice. Responsibility, therefore, exists at several levels. This layered interpretation may feel less dramatic than declaring a single mastermind, but it better reflects how public violence often occurs. A murder can be both spontaneous and prepared, both personal and institutional, both religious and political. Hypatia's death belongs to all of these categories. Why, then, has her name survived when the names of so many ancient scholars have disappeared? Part of the answer is the horror of the crime. A brilliant teacher publicly dismembered by a mob is difficult to forget. Part is the symbolic power of her identity. She was a woman in philosophy, a pagan teacher with Christian students, a mathematician in a city of religious conflict, and an advisor caught between church and state. Different ages have found different meanings in her. Advocates for women in science remember her as evidence that women participated in mathematics and astronomy long before modern universities admitted them. Defenders of intellectual freedom remember her as a thinker destroyed by political hatred. Critics of religious institutions use her story to warn against clerical power. Christian writers who condemns the murder use it to show the difference between faith and fanaticism. Historians use the case to study late Roman government, urban crowds, gender, and the transformation of the ancient Mediterranean. Each interpretation reveals something, but each can also distort if it turns Hypatia into nothing more than a symbol. The real woman remains partly hidden because her own voice is almost entirely lost. We know her through other people, students who admired her, historians who praised or condemned her, enemies who accused her, and later writers who reshaped her. Her mathematical writings do not survive securely under her name. We cannot read a personal diary describing her hopes or fears. We do not know what she thought when the conflict between Orestes and Cyril intensified. Did friends warn her? Did she believe her reputation would protect her? Did she consider leaving Alexandria? Did she refuse because the city was her home and her students depended on her? These questions cannot be answered. The silence invites imagination, but responsible storytelling must mark the boundary between possibility and evidence. What we can say is that Hypatia chose a public life of teaching and intellectual service. She did not disappear into safety when political tension increased, at least not soon enough to escape the danger. Her continued presence suggests courage, confidence, duty, or perhaps an underestimation of the hatred gathering around her. She may have believed that reasoned conversation could still influence events. Philosophers were trained to value self-command and to face uncertainty with discipline. Yet philosophy could not negotiate with a group that had already accepted the idea that she was the enemy. Her death, therefore, represents a failure of civic life. Politics ceased to be a contest among arguments and institutions and became the physical destruction of a person. The people of Alexandria lost more than a mathematician. They lost a mediator who connected philosophical culture, elite education, and public administration. Even if her influence has been exaggerated in later legend, her absence mattered because the manner of her removal demonstrated that dialogue had been replaced by terror. The tragedy was not that reason vanished forever. The tragedy was that in that moment reason had no power over men convinced that violence was righteous. The case also warns against the seduction of historical inevitability. Because we know that Hypatia died, every earlier event can appear to lead naturally towards murder. But the outcome was not unavoidable. Cyril and Orestes could have reached a political compromise. Imperial authorities could have intervened more effectively. Religious leaders could have condemned rumors. Civic elites could have protected Hypatia. The monks who attacked Orestes could have been restrained before the culture of violence deepened. Peter and his followers could have chosen not to act. History is made from decisions, not from destiny. Recognizing alternatives is important because it restores moral responsibility. The murder was not the automatic result of ancient religious conflict. It was the consequence of choices made by people operating within that conflict. Each choice narrowed the space for peaceful resolution until violence became possible. This is why the story remains relevant. Societies often believe that their institutions are strong enough to contain hatred. They assume respected figures are safe because everyone knows their value. They dismiss rumors as foolish until the rumors organize a crowd. Hypatia's life shows how quickly social respect can collapse when political actors redefine a person as a threat. Her killers did not need to defeat her ideas in debate. They only needed enough people to believe that she stood in the way of peace. In the end, Hypatia was not murdered simply because she studied mathematics, and she was not killed in a single clear battle between science and Christianity. She died because she occupied a dangerous intersection. She was a pagan philosopher in a Christianizing empire, but she also taught Christians. She was a woman with public authority in a male political world. She was a respected advisor to a governor locked in conflict with a powerful bishop. She became the subject of rumors, claiming that her influence prevented reconciliation. Those rumors turned her into a political symbol, and symbols are easier to attack than human beings. The mob that seized her believed, or claimed to believe, that removing her would defend their community and resolve a larger struggle. Instead, they committed a crime that brought lasting disgrace to the city and to the cause they intended to serve. We may never know whether Cyril ordered the murder. The surviving record does not permit that certainty, but we know that the attackers emerged from the political environment surrounding his conflict with Orestes. We know that Hypatia's death benefited the bishop's position and weakened the governor's. We know that Peter and his followers acted with shocking confidence and that no remembered punishment balanced the crime. We know that a Christian historian close to the period condemned the killing and insisted that such violence had nothing to do with genuine Christianity. And we know that the attempt to erase Hypatia failed. Her body was destroyed, but her name survived. The scholars who cannot read her lost work still study her life. The city that failed to protect her remains connected to her memory. The political leaders who seem more powerful in 415 are now often introduced through the story of the woman caught between them. Her killers reduced her to an obstacle, but history restored her complexity. She was a teacher, philosopher, mathematician, advisor, daughter, and mentor. She was not the last light of the ancient world because knowledge continued after her. But she became a lasting warning about what happens when knowledge is politicized, when rumor replaces evidence, when leaders define opponents as enemies, and when crowds mistake brutality for justice. More than 16 centuries after the carriage was stopped in Alexandria, the final question is not only who killed Hypatia. The deeper question is how a society that respected her learning allowed her to become killable. The answer lies not in one moment of rage, but in the slow construction of fear. A struggle for power, a breakdown of trust, the public, naming of an enemy, the spread of accusation, and the silence of institutions that failed to intervene. Hypatia's murder was the final act. The crime began long before the mob touched her carriage, and that may be the most important reason her story still matters today.